Well, Elaine, it's so wonderful to have you on the podcast today. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Yes, and for all of those listening, Elaine is all the way in England, so it's nighttime her time, and I'm still drinking my Starbucks this morning.
Yeah, it's going to get dark here pretty soon, so we might just notice a change in the outside conditions.
Oh, yes, wonderful. And it's beautiful, beautiful evening in England. Elaine is an expert on leadership and the owner of Blue Gnu Consulting. GNU, did I say it right this
Yes,
time?
you did. Yeah, yeah.
So tell me a little bit about your business, what your specialty is, and a little bit of history behind what you do.
Yeah. Blue Gnu is nearly 10 years old, but I've been self-employed, for want of a better way of putting it, for nearly 13 years. And what we do here is try to make workplaces happier in its simplest form. That's our overall kind of intention. And how we do that typically is through learning and development initiatives, so kind of training workshops, typically for leaders, board level executives, and teams actually of all shapes and sizes. So sometimes we might be working on a team who are experiencing change or a challenge or a conflict, even. And other times we're trying to be proactive in supporting leaders to be better equipped to deal with some of the management and leadership issues and problems that might come their way.
Great. And do you specialize in any industry or do you work with all sorts of businesses?
Yeah, no, the great thing about working in the industry of learning and people is that people are in every industry. So that it doesn't really matter if you're leading a big global pharmaceutical company or if you run your own business, that essentially the leadership capability is pretty similar, like the core skills, the core behaviors needed to be a leader, and to be part of an effective team are the same. It doesn't matter if you're a sports team and you play a sport with some people, or if you're a team who manufacture a product, or if you're a team of sales representatives who go out and try and deliver effective sales. it, People are people and teams are teams. So we're actually really lucky in that we get to work across a lot of different industries, um, which is really nice because then we've got a lot to draw from in terms of experience of the different types of leaders. So yeah, I don't want to make leadership sound simple. I don't think that it is. I think it's highly complex, but essentially those core behaviors, when we peel right back to, well, what does it take to be a good leader or the best leader that you could be? um, I feel like the patterns of behavior are similar. The application might be completely different, but the behaviors themselves are pretty core.
I love that you're like the first thing you said about your company is that you try to make workplaces happier. And I
Yeah,
love distilling everything you do into just that main point. Like, that is why we want to develop leadership and why we want a
yeah,
good culture so that people are happier and more fulfilled and more productive.
yeah,
So, what type of
exactly
things
that.
do you teach? Like, how do you get people there?
It's a really great question, and it's multifactorial in terms of the answer. Like, it's difficult to say that it would just be one thing. This model that you can see on the wall behind me, that's one of our key models that we use, and we might meet a lot of people using this. It's called Insights Discovery. It's a global model, so that many of your American or other audiences might recognize it. But it was invented 25 years ago by a Scottish company, so proudly British organization, who took the kind of psychological works of Carl Jung, who was a Swiss German psychologist, and they've transformed it into a workplace preference model that helps us understand, well, how might I show up at work with my preferences, and how might that be different from you? And from that foundation of self understanding, we can do a lot of work, because if I understand me, then that gives me a different lens to look at self, but it also gives me a lovely lens to have a great conversation with you about how you show up. And that tends to be our entry point with most of our client organizations that we work with. So this is great for individuals. It's also great for teams. It's really brilliant for leaders because there's a lot of misperception around on here, if we look at the color preferences, kind of what a great leader might be, and there's a word up there, you probably can't read it, but right in the red section it says director. So there could be a huge misjudgment, I guess, that in order to be a leader, you need a lot of red energy in the model, and actually that's not true. So yeah, we use insights. We also use another tool called motivational maps, which looks at, so if insights is behaviors and traits and how we show up, motivational maps looks at the level below, which is why I might behave in the way that I behave. So it's more looking at drivers. So
Mhm.
what are those things that get me out of bed in the morning, or when do I do my best work? What conditions do I need? So yeah, those are a couple of the tools that we use to kind of start that process, really.
Oh, that's so fascinating. Your model behind you, I see some of the words. I see coordinator, supporter,
Yeah,
motivator.
helper at the bottom. Yeah. Inspirer, motivator, director, and reformer. So they're all those words are meant to be like indicative of a style.
Right.
But if I'm honest, and I'm pretty picky, um, I'd quite like insights, and I've been telling them for a little while. I'd quite like them to change some of those words, because it indicates to me that coordinator, for instance, that it sounds a bit like a title or a role. And actually, it's not a title or a role, it's a behavior. So I'd quite like them to change it to an ing word. So coordinating to me is more indicative of the style of what it means to be in this bluey greeny area. So that's a coordinating style. I'm very good at logistics, organizing stuff, kind of making people feel at home and welcoming them and kind of, putting on great things for them to do. But that doesn't mean I'm a coordinator in my role. So yeah, I'm really picky about that, but I'd love them to change it. So the words were doing words rather than role title words.
And once a leader knows where they fall, does that help? How does that help them? What does that do to help them become better?
That's a really great question. And you, it depends on the leader, to be completely honest. So,
Mhm.
a metaphor that sometimes I find myself using when I'm talking to clients is that it kind of depends what type of mirror that the leader is looking in. So, some leaders come to us with real curiosity about who they are and how they show up, and they really want to look in the bathroom mirror. So the mirror that has all the lights and you can see everything that's going on in your face, and it's like, oh, you can just see that tiny little wrinkle
They're
or that
always
tiny
in
little.
hotels too. I'm like, whoa.
Yeah, yeah, that one. The one that spins around and it has the light on and you
Right.
can. Yeah. So some leaders come to us really wanting to look in the mirror because they're so keen to become more self-aware so that they can move forwards in terms of which are the bits I need to improve, which are the bits that I need to pay attention to, or which parts do I already do well that I know I can do more of the time. Um, but we also meet some leaders who aren't willing to look in that mirror. So
Mhm.
that's really interesting. They might want to look in a different mirror, which might be the one in the, I don't know, in the bar or in the restaurant that's got some kind of softer lighting that makes you look great no matter which direction you look in, because it's not quite as harsh, I guess. So it really depends on the leaders and kind of where we can only meet leaders where they are. We can't force them to change. But what we do encourage is that any look in any mirror is a good place. And we would hope to deepen your self understanding by encouraging you to look in the slightly harsher mirror. So we might also do some work with leaders in the shadow space. So often when I'm looking in the mirror, I can see this, right? I can see what's happening right in front of me. But we also might do some work in terms of leadership shadow, which is, well, do I ever pay attention to the shadow that I cast, and how long is it and how dark is it back there? And do people ever give me feedback around how they experience me, which is often in my shadow? It's not usually right here. So we hope to give the leaders that we get to work with some experiences or some feedback about what it's like to be on the receiving end of you, because not all of them might be aware of that. Some leaders have been leading people for 20, 30 years and never received any feedback about what it's like to be on the receiving end of them. So we do quite a lot of work in that space, which is really exciting.
Yeah, that is I love that term leadership shadow. I've never heard that
Mm,
before. I
mm,
I immediately thought of one university president that I've worked with who is charismatic and bold and a great like motivator, but the issue with him that I saw working with him on a marketing standpoint is he's so bold that
yeah,
when he speaks, his shadow silences everybody else. And
yeah.
even if there's clearly something that needs to be said, nobody's willing to say it.
No, because it's hard to speak up in that
Yeah,
shadow, right? It's hard to speak up, it's hard to be creative, it's hard to give some new ideas, it's hard to challenge.
it's very
Um, so
hmm
you could that kind of leadership style, if it's consistent and over time, can create some real problems, some real, people can feel a bit squashed or a bit held back if they don't get the chance to express themselves fully. And that comes directly from the leader. And I think, another phrase that I use quite a lot, and I hope it's not too British, but a lot of leaders don't always appreciate that they are exceptionally visible. So another phrase we would use is that, the people who report into any leader in any organization, in any environment, they usually notice everything and they say nothing. So people spot all of our behaviors because leaders and managers are, more visible. So people can see what we're doing, they can see what we're all about. And the fish rots from the head is an expression that I like
I
to use. So if
love that expression.
there's poor behavior, poor leadership behavior, then you often see poor culture and some potential toxic behaviors coming from team members because we're watching and observing someone else role modeling some slightly less healthy behaviors in teams, and that gets magnified the further down the organization that we go. And again, if leaders have never been brave enough to look at their shadow or curious enough to understand how people experience me, then they may be accidentally disengaging teams for a very long time before they get the feedback, because it's really difficult to give feedback, particularly to
Oh, yeah.
exceptionally senior people.
Yeah, I mean, even I remember even with this particular leader, there was a big decision that needed to be made, and I was facilitating the research that we had done, and he decided to speak first, and then the rest of his leadership team wouldn't say anything.
Hmm.
And what he had said was not supported by the research. So now, as the consultant, I'm obligated to share that, right? But other people in the room knew it too. They wouldn't
Yeah,
they wouldn't comment at all. They wouldn't, even though they'd participated with the research, they weren't willing to state their opinion because this leader
yeah,
was just so, I guess, powerful, and
yeah,
very persuasive, great speaker, very persuasive. I don't think he was aware. So I love this idea of looking in the mirror, but also looking at the shadow.
yeah.
And what a great saying, fish rots from the head. Very British. I love it.
It's not a popular phrase to use when I'm working with leaders. It has to be the right time if I think it's necessary to mention it. But I just think there's any change starts with an awakening, doesn't it? Any change starts with a consciousness about learning something new about myself or realizing, hang on a minute, I didn't know that about myself. And I think eh, people don't often realize the impact of sometimes some quite what might be perceived as inconsequential behaviors, the kind of lasting impact and the cascade of that impact throughout an organization. So it's yeah, we that's a problem we hope to solve at Blue Gnu, is kind of like helping people to understand their leadership footprint. So, what is that, and how can I be aware of the footprints I left and the footprints I intend to leave in the future?
So before the break, we were talking about leadership shadows. We were talking about this great British saying that fish rots from the head, and just having leaders be brave enough to take a look at themselves to see how they can improve their own style. And I wanted to talk specifically about your work with universities. Most of our audience are colleges and university leaders. So tell
Mhm.
me a little bit about the work in that space and maybe some things that you've learned from working with university leaders.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting working with university leadership because it's got a different kind of vibe than a corporate entity. But of course, there's lots of um, transferable skills from a leader perspective, but also transferability of models. And I think one of the biggest things, and we're actively working with the British University and their kind of exec board at the moment. So without giving away too much about that, but I think the complexity of the organization and kind of the competing priorities of the different faculties that report up to, in the UK, we'd call the president like the vice chancellor. I think what's really interesting challenge for that person in charge is to hold together quite a complex team. Whereas if you consider the work we might do with a more profit making corporate organization, is that often they're all pulling in the same direction. So we get a bit of cohesive kind of direction and vision, and we're all pulling to that. Whereas our experience of working with a couple of universities in the UK is that those different faculties, those different departments might have some very competing different targets. And so they're not all pulling in the same direction. So the challenge becomes, how do we help them understand how they need to work together and how those faculties or departments can become interdependent and begin to learn to rely on each other rather than siloed, rather than kind of independent business units within the university structure. I think that for me is a big thing. And also I think what we're hearing in the UK is the pressure of digital transformation on the education sector. So, and I think ultimately that rolls up into leaders needing to be aware of what that means, and how a digital transformation needs to be led, because often the senior people at the university might not be the people with a full enough understanding of the root cause of the need for the digital transformation. So that's another step change, which might be different than our corporate customers because they might be more invested in digital transformation programs because it's directly related to their profits, right? There's a bit more resistance, I think, in the university sector to digital transformation. Don't know if is it the same in the US?
Oh, yes. And actually something that you said just hit the nail on the head so well with what we see with all of our clients. And where I think that a company like yours can really help is this concept of silos.
Yeah,
And I've worked in education so long that I've forgotten what it's like to work outside of it. But that is one of the most common complaints that we hear is that there's these different divisions and they're just working independent of each other. And sometimes their work is in conflict with each other.
yeah,
And the leader, the head of the college, is the one who's supposed to bring them all together, but they may be so busy with what they're supposed to be doing that they're
hmm,
relying on their leaders to run those divisions. And the
yeah.
student is the one that ends up suffering when one arm isn't talking to the other arm and processes don't align and everybody's confused. And it does create a lot of problems, these different silos. So
Mm.
very,
And I think as much as, and again, I said at the beginning, like, the leadership problems are leadership problems regardless of sector. And it would be remiss of me to have you think that siloed organizations are only in the education sector, because that's not true. Like, a lot of our clients struggle with this whole idea of we are a big team, but we all do have conflicting priorities. And sometimes when they are in direct conflict with each other, like, how do we navigate those conversations? Because a lot of these leadership challenges come back to how we talk to each other, and how we roll up into that bigger vision rather than stay stuck in our small silo.
right. And how do we make change in an organization that moves very slowly and
Yeah.
can be a little bit, you know, you would think that that a higher ed embraces change, but in fact, most don't. They
Yeah.
like tradition and thoughtfulness and collegiality, things that typically make change slow. But the
Yeah.
world's changing really fast.
It's changing really fast. Yeah. And it'll only ever be as slow change as it is today, right? It's just going to get
Mhm.
faster. So, I think I sort of think colleges and universities have an obligation almost to try and get to the front of the queue when it comes to change, because they're educating the next generation of people that are ultimately going to land in the workplace in a few years' time. So if they're not at the front of all sorts of transformation and change, then they're not, like you said, with the putting the student at the heart of everything. We owe it to that student to have them finish their education with all the tools and techniques that they need, and that needs to be the tools and techniques of 2024, not best practice from
Right.
whenever. So it's a tough challenge. I don't envy, because how do you stay true to, like, in the UK, we've got some really old university organizations that have such heritage and such, they're world renowned for their kind of traditions and the way they educate, and how do they stay true to that at the same time as, you know creating an educational experience that leads people into the world of work as it is today. I think it's a real delicate balance for people to be able to hold. And I think acknowledgement of that it's not easy and it's not straightforward is one of the first steps.
Yeah, for sure. And that takes a strong leader to be able to, you know, get everybody on the same lane going towards a shared vision. So
Mm, mm,
definitely a challenge. I think another challenge that I see at colleges and universities is how promotions happen. So
mm,
a lot of time a lead faculty member becomes a dean, or somebody who's really good at coordinating becomes an administrator. And so these
mm,
promotions happen from within, and usually what I've seen is they are the people who have been the best workers, who get along with
mhm.
everybody, will be promoted, but maybe they're not ready to supervise, especially their other
Yeah.
colleagues and friends. And what advice do you have for people who are new leaders who may find themselves in these positions, especially if they have to start doing hard things with people that were their friends and colleagues before they became, you know, leaders?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question. But I think there's definitely some top tips I could offer in terms of how, if that's just recently happened and you're at a beginning of a journey, because what you've just said there is part of the reason we're in business. Because
Right.
many managers and leaders get promoted because they were technically brilliant at whatever it was that they used to do. And I think there was a Harvard Business Review that came out about 6 months or so ago, saying that something like 89% of people who are currently managing and leading people, and presumably it was a study from the US, I don't know, but because it came from Harvard, maybe, 89% of managers and leaders do not have any formal management or leadership training. So no, that isn't that interesting. But that shows that we're promoting it just globally. A lot of leaders and managers are getting promoted because they're technical experts. Now it gives us a three-way problem in the workplace, because we promote someone who was previously brilliant at the job. So we've, by that promotion, we've inherited someone with an inherent lack of skill and ability in the actual leading of people. We've also created a recruitment gap behind, because we now have to recruit to backfill them. And the people on the receiving end are kind of going, hang on a minute, you've just created a massive dynamic change in the department, which is, hence your question, like, how do we how do we do that? And I think in terms of my first top tip, if someone has recently been promoted, or if I now find myself in a management role where I previously wasn't, I think one of the biggest and most important things we should do at that stage, particularly if it's at the beginning of the relationship, is to set out the boundaries. So what I would call a really important contracting conversation. So acknowledging the fact that, oh, things are about to change around here, or maybe they have already changed, talking really openly and vulnerably about the impact of that on the person, because it's not an easy journey to suddenly manage someone new. Um, and to begin to have those important early conversations about, oh, this is the sort of manager that I think I want to be. So I want to create this, this, and this in our relationship together. And what is it that you want from me? So I would call that a contracting conversation. Doesn't have, you don't have to write anything down or sign anything, but I think that expectation setting from the off of, look, this is what I would like to do in our relationship together, and how do we regularly come back to that and give each other feedback, is really, really important. But many people will just go, oh, it'll be all right. I think I've got this, and they might forget or not realize the kind of significance of just how much time and pain an early conversation about that can resolve, particularly because I think the boundaries have changed, right? Like, so the boundaries changed in the relationship, so we need to acknowledge that a little bit. um and I also think second top tip is that we need a bit of a reframe on what it is to have a tricky conversation. Because if we frame it as a tricky conversation, it will always be tricky. And many of us, regardless of our preferences, find conversations tricky, particularly if it's with someone that I used to be friends with and now I'm managing them. Um, they're just conversations. It might not be tricky at all. In fact, what we know, what we learn in our work, is that many managers completely overthink the conversation and make many assumptions and judgments about what may or may not happen before they even arrive in the room. And it's kind of that kind of thinking that can lead us into trouble, because we might discourage ourselves from having the conversation before it gets to a crucial or a difficult stage. So the reframe is, it's not a difficult conversation, it's just a conversation. But we also need to have those conversations far earlier than we think, whereas there's a natural human bias to avoid conflict. And so we avoid until we get to a place where we think, darn it, now I'm going to have to say the thing or do the thing. Um,
And
so
what I've
yeah,
learned as a leader too is some conversations have to be had. And then by avoiding them, as a leader, you're actually creating more problems with other staff members who are like,
yeah,
why isn't she doing anything about this? Like, this has been going
exactly.
on for so long. Like,
Yeah, I'll take you back to that phrase I said earlier. Your team notice everything and say nothing. So they absolutely notice if there is a lower level performer in the team and that's not getting addressed, the team will notice it and say nothing. But gradually their engagement, their performance, their everything begins to go, oh, hang on a minute, until we course correct and move it forward. So yeah, it's a really tricky, I don't want people to think that just because there's a few top tips that it's easy. Like, I think leadership is a life's work. Like, I don't think it's the sort of thing you can go on a course and yay, I'm fixed. I think it's kind of, it's constant practice and constant challenge, and it really helps if you have a few models and a few resources to help you on the way. And if you can get some formal leadership training, that's brilliant. There are so many training organizations out there that do what we do, and so many like approved courses. Like, we're approved by the British Institute of Leadership, which is brilliant for us. Like, that's, it's a real sign over the door that what we do meets a high quality standard. And I'd encourage people to get really curious about what sort of opportunities are available to them locally to develop your own practice, because it is a life's work. It doesn't matter where you're at with leadership. I don't think anyone's perfect. And I think
right.
we can all be better at work to make work a better and happier place for our teams and our people.
I agree 100%. And I also think it's really important what you said that it's not like a one and done, right? This is a
No.
constant, things change, people change, leaders change, and we can always be growing and improving. Technology
Mm.
changes. And so I think that's something people need to think through. I see a lot of investment in initiatives in the university and colleges. So one year it might be
Mm,
like, let's do everybody do Myers-Briggs, and then you hold a
yeah.
workshop and then you never talk about it again. There's no
I
follow-up.
know. I know. And that makes me so sad. And I try and be really intentional with our clients because we do get sometimes those kind of requests like, oh, hey, we have an away day. Can
Yeah.
you come and do it? And and I'm always, I have a mini kind of business owner moment of yay, that would be a great project for us to be involved with. But then I also have my bigger, more important values kick in around I really don't want to do it if it's just going to be a one and done because I just don't, that doesn't help me to achieve my personal vision and our business vision of making the world of work a better place for everyone, right? If you're only going to give me one day, I that's not a good thing. So, one of our values is partnership, and we really mean it. Like we like to work with our client organizations if we can on an ongoing basis because we don't want it to be like, yay, we did this thing and we had a great day out, but now we're just going to forget all about it until the next one. We want people to get that return on investment. And return on investment is such a difficult thing to measure in the people industry, because it's really hard to say how a few £100 or a few $100 investment in a person will make a difference to their happiness, but we kind of know that it does. So, and for some people, the same investment may only improve happiness by a little bit, and for other people, it may improve happiness by a lot. So it's really difficult to say, well, you spend X pounds or X dollars and you'll get X back into your business. But we know that it's a great idea because we see engagement scores, we see happiness scores, we see performance indicators, confidence and capability around leadership skills and processes increasing, and that can only be a good thing for organizations. um, but it's a tough one to measure. I'd love to be able to measure it more, but that's the nature of humans, right? Like you and me could go on the same program and you might learn a bazillion things that help you, and I might be like, oh, I've seen a lot of that before actually. So or whatever, it could be the other way around. It's difficult to say that there's a linear return on investment, but I'd love to be able to study it better.
Oh, well, we have the same question in marketing.
Yeah,
You show an ad and it gets, 20 people excited and another 20 are like, yeah, whatever.
whatever.
But it's always better than doing nothing. And that's
Yeah,
tell my clients like this investments in your team, investments in marketing is always going to help the organization. It's never
yeah.
going to hurt. So,
No, exactly. It's rarely harmful. Do you know
yes.
what I mean? It's kind of more often than not does more good than not. But if it is only a one thing, if it is only a one-time investment, I think that's also a message from the leadership to the people. Because if the leaders are saying, "Yeah, we'll do it once on a Thursday in November," but they never come back to it again, the people notice everything and say nothing, and they're like, "Oh, they told us when we first started working here, they said that personal development was really key and that they were going to invest in us. And actually, we had one day on a Thursday in November, and there's nothing else, So it's kind of it I think if you're going to talk about personal development in your business and you're going to talk about it in your recruitment and your marketing, you've absolutely got to put your money where your mouth is when it comes to investing in people because they notice it all, but they won't give the feedback to the leaders because it's usually too risky to do that.
Well, this conversation has been so fascinating, and I'm super excited now about like my own team and looking at
Yeah.
and applying some of these thoughts and ideas to the way that I lead. And I know that you do work in the United States. Most of our listeners
Mm.
are here in the US. And if anybody's interested in talking to you more or getting in touch with you, how do they do that?
The best way is if people use LinkedIn actually, because we're really prolific on LinkedIn. We get lots of really good feedback. So we try and use our socials to offer value. Like we we're genuinely in the business of trying to make the world a better place. So we don't hide everything behind a paywall, if that makes sense. So if people reach out to us on LinkedIn, you can get me, Elaine Gosden, or you can follow our company. We've actually got a reasonable size following at Blue Gnu Consulting. We share leadership tips. We share team tips. We share all sorts of useful content. Just last week, we did a quiz on like what's your leadership style to get people kind of, thinking about how they might show up. Um, so yeah, the socials is usually the best way, or we have got a website. It's really rather lovely. I like it. bluegnuco.com, bluegnuco.com. So yeah, you can find us out there.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Elaine, and thanks for taking this evening to talk to me
I
and
know I
conversation
said it was going to get
starter.
dark and it is. Yeah.
It's been a great conversation, and I just love the work that you're doing.
Oh, thank you. And it was so great to meet you. I'm so glad we met.